Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into one of the most, I guess you'd call it concentrated periods of centralized authority in the Middle Ages, the era of the medieval Inquisition.
Right. And before everyone's mind jumps to the Spanish version centuries later, it's really important to focus on what this system was at its core.
Which was a specialized legal system.
Exactly. It wasn't just some random witch hunt. The medieval Inquisition was a formal, organized system created by the Catholic Church, and it had a very specific mission: find and prosecute heretics.
And a heretic was basically just anyone whose religious beliefs went against the official teachings of the Church in Rome.
That's it. So the mission was clear, but the context here is everything. Why create this whole system? Why couldn't the local bishops just handle it?
That's a key question.
Well, because the church felt its authority was genuinely breaking apart. We're talking about the 12th and 13th centuries, and new religious movements were gaining serious ground.
So for the Church, this wasn't just a debate over ideas.
Not at all. They saw heresy like a fast-spreading disease, a spiritual sickness that could doom the souls of the entire community.
A disease that needed a centralized response.
Precisely. To control that spread, Pope Gregory IX formally set up the system in 1231. This was a huge strategic move. It took the power to prosecute heresy away from local officials who were often, poorly trained or superstitious.
And put it in the hands of specialists.
Exactly. Specialized legal experts. So knowing that, let's look at who actually ran these trials. The Inquisitors themselves?
Yeah, who were these guys?
Well, they were not your average village priests. The Pope specifically chose men from these new, highly respected religious orders, the Dominicans and the Franciscans.
Why them, though? Why those two groups in particular?
It was incredibly strategic. First, they were highly educated. They were experts in religious law, so they could spot tiny deviations from official teaching that a local priest might completely miss.
And the Dominicans were known for their preaching skills, right?
Yeah. They were famous for it. They were formidable in any kind of religious debate. And then you have the Franciscans, who brought this element of credibility.
How so?
Well, a lot of the heretical movements criticized the church for being too wealthy and corrupt. But the Franciscan and Dominican friars were known for living simple lives of poverty. So you couldn't accuse them of hunting heretics just to protect their own riches.
That's smart. And maybe the most important part of their power. They answered only to the Pope.
That direct loyalty was huge. It meant an inquisitor could cross borders, operate in a kingdom completely separate from the local bishop or even the king.
So when an inquisitor showed up in your town, he arrived with the full power of the papacy behind him.
Yes. And that created an immediate atmosphere of serious authority.
Okay, so let's talk about what happened when they actually arrived. The whole process was very structured. It didn't start with arrests.
No, it started with a public spectacle. The inquisitor would call everyone together for a big public speech, a sermon. And he'd talk about the dangers of heresy and the spiritual risk to the whole town.
And this is when he announced the period of grace, which is, I think, one of the more surprising parts of this.
It is. It usually lasted about a month, 30 days. And it was a critical tool. It was basically a kind of religious amnesty.
So if you came forward on your own.
If you came forward voluntarily, confessed your mistakes, and repented, you were promised much lighter punishments. You could usually avoid the worst penalties and just stay in your community.
It sounds merciful, but it was also a brilliant intelligence-gathering strategy.
Oh, absolutely. Because every person who confessed during that grace period gave the inquisitor a list of names.
The people they met with, where they talked?
Right. And on top of that, the inquisitor actively encouraged people to report anyone they suspected who didn't come forward to confess.
You can just imagine the suspicion that created. You're being told it's your religious duty to report your neighbor or your coworker.
Or even your own family members. It was devastating for community trust. And once that 30-day period was up, the voluntary phase was over.
And the much more serious secret investigations began.
That's when the formal trials would start.
Okay, so once the Inquisitor has this list of suspects, what exactly are they trying to prove? What was the official definition of heresy?
The definition was very specific, both legally and theologically. Heresy was the stubborn denial of a truth that Catholics were required to believe.
So it wasn't about making a mistake.
No. If you just made a mistake but were willing to be corrected, you were usually fine. Heresy was about the choice. It was knowing the official teaching and deliberately choosing to believe something else anyway. The stubbornness was the crime.
And they had specific groups they were targeting, right? They weren't just looking for random individuals.
For sure. The main targets were groups like the Waldensians, or especially the Cathars in southern France. The Waldensians, for instance, preached about poverty and believed ordinary people should be able to preach, which challenged the church's hierarchy.
But the Cathars, they were a whole different level of threat.
A whole different level. The Cathars had a dualistic belief system. They believed the material world, our bodies, money, even the church's buildings, was created by an evil force. Only the spiritual world was good.
Which means they rejected pretty much everything the church stood for.
They rejected the core beliefs, like the sacraments and rituals. So for the church, this complete rejection of their authority and wealth made the Cathars public enemy number one.
So let's get into the actual legal procedure, because this is where the system was really different from other medieval courts.
Right. It was called the inquisitorial process. In most courts at the time, one person accused another, and they both presented evidence.
But not here.
No. The inquisitorial process put all the power into one person's hands. The inquisitor. He was the investigator, the prosecutor, and the judge, all rolled into one.
And there was no jury. The accused almost never had a lawyer.
Exactly. And to make it even harder for the person on trial, you often weren't told who accused you.
That seems incredibly unfair. Why would they do that?
Well, the official reason was to protect the witnesses from revenge, and that was a real concern. But you can see how that system could be abused. Oh, yeah. People could settle old scores or personal arguments knowing they would be anonymous.
And the accused had no way to challenge their accuser's credibility. But the whole goal, the thing they wanted more than anything else, was a confession.
A confession was considered the ultimate proof.
Yes. The thinking was that since heresy was a crime of the soul, only God truly knew who was guilty. So the court felt it had to get the truth directly from the defendant's own mouth.
And they were, in a weird way, very modern about their record keeping.
Incredibly so. They wrote everything down, every statement, every testimony. This bureaucracy made them super efficient. They could track a suspect who moved from France to Italy 20 years later, pull out the old records, and prove they'd returned to heresy.
Which brings us to the darkest part of the process.
Yeah.
The move from just questioning people to, well, to torture. That was a huge and dark step. It happened in 1252, when Pope Innocent V officially authorized the use of physical torture to get confessions.
And this was new. The church had historically been against using torture in its own courts.
It was a major shift. Now, there were supposed to be rules.
Right, there were limits.
In theory.
Yeah.
The rules said torture was a last resort, and you couldn't use it in a way that would kill or permanently injure someone.
And a confession made under torture wasn't immediately valid, was it?
Correct. For it to be legally valid, the accused had to repeat the confession the next day, voluntarily, without being tortured. But, the psychological threat of it happening again was often enough to make people confirm whatever they'd said.
Even if they were innocent.
Even if they were innocent, just to make it stop.
So once the investigation was over, what about the punishments? They weren't all the same.
Not at all. They varied a lot. For minor offenses, or if you confessed early, the punishment was usually a public penance, things like fasting or going on a long pilgrimage.
And there's the yellow cross.
Yes, being forced to wear a big yellow cross sewn onto your clothes. The goal was public shame. Everyone in your town knew who you were and what you'd done.
What about for more serious cases?
For those, you could be sent to prison, sometimes for life. And another very harsh penalty was having all your property taken away.
Which would destroy your family.
It would leave them with nothing, even if they weren't heretics themselves.
And then the ultimate penalty, burning at the stake. How often did that actually happen?
Thankfully, executions were a small percentage of the total cases. This was saved for people who absolutely refused to repent or for relapsed heretics.
Meaning someone who was forgiven once but then went back to their old beliefs?
Exactly. And there's a key detail here. The church itself did not execute anyone.
Right. They would hand the person over to the secular, the non-religious government official?
Precisely. The church's role was spiritual. So they would relax the unrepentant heretic, which is the term they used, to the local lord or magistrate. And in secular law, heresy was treated like treason.
A crime against the state.
Yes. And the penalty for treason was death, usually by burning. It was a public spectacle designed to enforce conformity through pure fear.
To really see the system in action, we have to look at the Cathars in southern France. This wasn't just a few trials, it was a long-term campaign.
That region was ground zero. The Cathars had a lot of support there, so at first the church tried a military crusade to get rid of them.
The Albigensian Crusade.
Right. But when the army couldn't completely stamp out the movement, The Inquisition was brought in to finish the job.
It became a permanent bureaucratic effort.
Yes, for the better part of a century, Inquisitors methodically hunted down every last Catholic community, using those amazing records to track family connections. And it worked. By the end of the 14th century, the movement was gone.
And that success is what made the Inquisition a permanent part of the church. But what was the impact on everyday life for regular people?
It was profound. People became incredibly careful about what they said. The system could pit family members against each other. And it definitely suppressed new ideas.
Because if you were a scholar, any new idea could be labeled heretical.
Exactly. It pushed people toward conformity.
Yeah.
But, and this is a surprising point, if you compare the Inquisition's courts to the local secular courts of the time,
They were often seen as more professional.
it's a crucial point. Local courts were often chaotic. They might use things like trial by ordeal, like making you hold a hot iron to see if you were guilty.
So not exactly based on evidence.
Not at all. Inquisitors, on the other hand, were trained lawyers following specific rulebooks. The process was brutal, but it was organized and based on gathering testimony, which was a kind of consistency that local courts just didn't have.
In the end, the medieval Inquisition was really a unique institution. It was designed to police not just what people did, but what they thought, all to enforce unity.
And the strange side effect for us today is that those incredibly detailed records they kept have survived. They give historians this amazing window into the daily lives, the beliefs, even the way ordinary medieval people talked.
A very dark chapter, but one that left behind an incredible amount of information.
Indeed.